And still on federal politics, our guests tonight in the studio are Labor's Maxine McKew, the Parliamentary Secretary for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government. And to argue the Liberal Party's case is Malcolm Turnbull, the member for Wentworth. Welcome to both of you.
Hi, Lee.
Malcolm Turnbull, on Saturday you tweeted the words of the French political thinker Alexis de Tocqueville. Events can move from the impossible to the inevitable without stopping at the probable. What were you alluding to there?
Well, nothing in particular, really, but I was really
Not hinting at a coalition election victory?
No, not really. People read that into it, but you shouldn't read too much into my tweets. I was reading a very interesting article in the New York Times, actually, about climate change and changes in climate change policy, which quoted that great line of de Tocqueville, probably the keenest commentator ever on American politics. 1830s was when he did his work.
On the weekend, when you sent that tweet, it was on the day where some very favourable polls, or a very favourable poll, had come out for the coalition. Since then, though, commentators are saying that perhaps Julia Gillard has regained some momentum and that Tony Abbott has peaked.
Well, I'm a retired commentator. I stopped being a political correspondent many, many years ago, and I'll leave it to you and the other political commentators. This is going to be a very tight election. It is very winnable for both sides, and we're working very, very hard to win this election and restore to Australia the quality and the calibre of government that it deserves.
Would you concede that the coalition is in an election-winning position now because it decided not to back the Labor government on the emissions trading scheme?
Look, I think I wouldn't concede. I would say that it's a winnable election. So, yes, we can win.
But you don't necessarily see that as the reason why the coalition's got to this position?
I think the emissions trading scheme was incredibly significant, but for a different reason. When Kevin Rudd abandoned it, he demonstrated that he was a man who led a government that lacked the courage of its own convictions. You see, in politics you can be forgiven up to a point, and I think this government has stretched that point for a degree of incompetence. But if you are seen to be hollow, if you're seen to have no heart, to believe in nothing, and that's what Kevin Rudd did. I mean, tragically for him, because he went to the 2007 election, and Maxine remembers it well, and he said, climate change is the greatest moral challenge of our times. We're going to answer that with an emissions trading scheme, which, of course, was our policy in the 2007 election as well. But that was his policy response. And then when the coalition changed its policy, instead of saying, OK, I've got a mandate for this, I'm going to the people, I'm going to have a double dissolution, he lost his nerve and walked away from it. And from that point, his support in the community, in the opinion polls, as evidenced in the opinion polls, crashed because he was seen to be lacking in conviction. And that's what you can't be forgiven for.
Let me pick up on that, because tonight at this community event in Rooty Hill, there has been some obvious cynicism from the crowd towards Labor and a seeming issue with whether they can trust Labor given everything that's happened. Maxine McKew, is it a case that Labor has brought it on itself, as Malcolm Turnbull would suggest?
Well, a couple of things. I agree with Malcolm that this is an incredibly tight election. It feels tight across the nation to me, and it certainly feels tight, in my area in Bennelong. I'm on a very tight margin, 1.4%, so I take nothing for granted. But I go back to Malcolm's point. Malcolm, you failed to take your party with you. If you were leading the Liberal Party today, we'd be on track to bring in an emissions trading system.
If John Howard had won the 2007 election, we'd probably have an emissions trading scheme.
Yeah, this is, the great tragedy.
Full of ironies, all this.
We had a string of tragedies, really. In the run-up to Copenhagen. You lost the leadership, you couldn't hold your party on that. I think that's a great pity. We then had the disappointment of Copenhagen, and the politics changed substantially.
But Maxine McKew, a lot's happened since then. You dumped the Prime Minister since then.
And I would say the disappointment, certainly when the decision was made to defer it, the disappointment was registered immediately in my electorate, and I made that clear. I talked about that with Kevin and others in my party. Now, I think the important thing is, as Julia has said now, we have to rebuild that consensus.
You've only got about 10 days, though.
Well, no, I think we've got a clear position there. It's certainly my view that, like Malcolm's, it is inevitable we will see change on this. It is inevitable we will see a price on carbon. Many of the big companies are already factoring this in to their business plans, but we do have to rebuild a consensus. I mean, it was very interesting, and you probably agree with this, Malcolm. I had climate change as a significant issue in my part of northwest Sydney. People want action on it, but I have to say, when the details of the CPRS were laid out, it was still very contentious. It was very contentious with our first package and then the amended package that we negotiated with you when you were leader.
Let me ask, if I can, about a policy that Labor has announced today, which is this joint project with the New South Wales State Labor Government to build the Chatswood-Parramatta rail link, which has been announced and re-announced over the past 12 years. Maxine McKew, is this not a transparent vote-grabbing exercise in 5 marginal Sydney seats?
The important thing about this, Lee, is that this is a great decision for commuters in Western Sydney and Northwest Sydney. I have to say this has been unanimously endorsed today by the Western Sydney mayors, by the Property Council, by the Sydney Chamber of Commerce, by the Ryde Business Forum in
Why is the federal government getting involved in what is patently a state issue?
Very, very interesting question, because our view is that the Commonwealth needs to be an active driver in urban policy. And Malcolm, this is your view. You were on Q&A a couple of weeks ago, and you take I think the entirely sensible view that we have such a significant infrastructure deficit that we have to have the Commonwealth involved as a key player. Now, I am hoping, Malcolm, that overnight you can persuade your colleagues to get on board. I noticed that when Anthony Albanese made the announcement that the Commonwealth will be funding, jointly with the Queensland Government, the important Redcliffe rail link, which will help ease congestion in northern Brisbane. The Liberals belatedly backed that.
All right,
That's great.
Let me ask Malcolm Turnbull,
what
do you think of federal Labor getting involved in this Chatswood-Parramatta rail link?
Well, I think you've really flagged it, Lee. I mean, this is a project that the Labor Party in New South Wales has announced and re-announced and not proceeded with so many times. I mean, the tragedy of public transport in Sydney is that we've had for over 15 years a government that has done virtually nothing. In that time, in that 15 years, the city of Shanghai has built a subway system that carries 6 million people a day. I mean, it has been a colossal failure. The cities of Adelaide, of Perth, of Brisbane, of Melbourne have all added to their public transport system in a way
with Commonwealth assistance. We have got investments on the table for public transport projects in every mainland capital city now.
But Maxine, that's not the point. I mean, the point I'm making is that state Labor here in New South Wales has been singularly unsuccessful. It has done much less than any other mainland state government in terms of public transport over that period.
So is it then a good thing that the federal government is stepping in?
Look, personally, I think it is a good thing. I always welcome investment in public transport infrastructure. I don't know what the competing priorities are in that part of Sydney, and I'll leave the official response to come from Barry O'Farrell, because it is primarily a state issue. But just to say that there has been a colossal failure to invest in public transport in the city of Sydney, and I compared Shanghai. That's a stark comparison, but you've only got to look at Perth or Adelaide, Brisbane or Melbourne to see how far Sydney's fallen behind with this dreadful state Labor government we've got here.
Let me ask you. Sorry, I want to move on to some different subjects. I'd like to move on. I'd like to move on to some different subjects. Okay. Malcolm Turnbull, the National Broadband Plan. You are a bit of a tech head. Multiple OECD reports tie GDP growth directly to a nation's connectivity. Surely then Labor's comprehensive high-speed rollout is better for Australia than the Coalition's slower option? No,
it's not. The Labor Party's plan is a colossal white elephant. It is going to spend at least $43 billion, possibly a great deal more, to create an asset that will be worth a fraction of that. So it is literally burning billions, tens of billions of dollars of taxpayers' money. Now,